Chapter 14 Supportive Therapy. Supportive therapy for avoiding individuals consists of what Benjamin calls generous doses of empathy and warm support, delivered without a hint of judgmentalism or rejection, providing evidence of a safe haven where acceptance rules. Benjamin also notes that in therapy, the AvPD's avoidance pattern is an especially intense version of the generic patient position. He or she wants to be accepted and loved, and holds back because of poor self-concept and fears of humiliation. The generic therapist position addresses this generic patient position, gradually helping the AvPD share intimacies and feelings of inadequacy or guilt and shame, while the therapist's benign and non-judgmental acceptance of the AvPD helps the AvPD begin to accept himself or herself, and as the therapy relationship strengthens, the patient can begin to explore his or her patterns. Following are three important cornerstones of my own supportive therapy approach to avoidance. 1. Liking and respecting the patient. Patients who perceive that their therapist likes and respects them feel that the therapist truly wants to help, leading them to feel accepted rather than rejected. A healing therapeutic response that can persist long after psychotherapy is over, as the patient carries the therapist's positivity around inside, with the therapist having become at least the one person in the avoidance life different from rejecting mother, emasculating father, and all the other hurtful and cruel people that inhabit the world of the avoidance scary past, frightening present, and dreaded future. 2. Offering the patient reassurance. Here are some reassuring messages that I give my anxious avoidant patients. Everyone experiences a degree of social anxiety. Avoidant patients who feel uniquely troubled or uniquely bad often find it reassuring to learn that they are not alone, because almost everyone gets anxious in social situations. Indeed, a big difference between a healthy and an avoidant response is the willingness to accept and tolerate a degree of social anxiety and continue to function in spite of it. Social anxiety can be overcome. Avoidant patients almost always benefit from hearing that their prognosis is good, for they have the gift of relating already inside, and all they have to do is unwrap it. All of us, even avoidants, have some control over what we allow others to do to us. Avoidants, like everyone else, have the option of staying away from or getting out of relationships with difficult, avoidogenic individuals, those who would make anyone anxious and drive just about everyone away, without feeling guilty or being criticized or stigmatized for doing so. Criticism is rarely fatal. Most of us survive the criticism that all of us get from time to time, no matter who we are or what we do. For example, most of us get through being put in can't-win situations, similar to that of the woman who was criticized for being a slut for showing her sexual feelings, then criticized for being cold, unavailable, and unresponsive for hiding them. There are ways to make even devastating criticism more tolerable. avoidance can find strength and approval from within by refusing to calculate their self-worth by their so-called reputation. It helps to recognize how often not us, but our critiques are the ones who deserve censure for elevating their own self-esteem by lowering the self-esteem of others. Furthermore, there is often a bright side to being criticized as people identify, sympathize with, and move in to support the underdog. Dealing with criticism is discussed further in Chapter 17. Fears are worries, not realities. Avoidance can be reassured that there is little or no justification for many of their fears. Flooding by and depletion of one's life force due to letting strong feelings loose can occur. But it is almost always mild and transitory, consisting of a mere passing sensation of fatigue. And while there are documented cases of grooms and best men passing out during a wedding ceremony, but with few to no real consequences, I know of only a relatively few documented cases of public speakers actually fainting, at least for emotional reasons, while giving a speech or appearing on TV. Guilt is almost always an overresponse. Guilt over minor peccadilloes is mostly the product of distortive thinking about one's past and present behavior, leading to inappropriate low self-esteem that breeds self-criticism and hence even more guilt. Anxiety almost always subsides shortly after starting an activity. Cresting over a phobic hump occurs as a result of denial and habituation, so that anxiety disappears to be replaced by a feeling of mastery, a pride in accomplishment, joy in activity, and sense of general elation, all of which are both pleasurable in themselves and a source of courage to try again. A case example. A patient, afraid to drive over a bridge at first, refused to try because he was generally too anxious to leave home and because of specific fears that something terrible might happen if he got behind the wheel. He would faint, lose control of his car, and bumping and crashing into other cars, die and kill others in a fiery crack-up. One day, he nonetheless forced himself to drive over a bridge. Predictably, anxiety began as soon as he got near the base of the bridge and increased as he ascended. Then, as he crested, his anxiety turned into a feeling of euphoria due to delight in accomplishment, happiness about his triumph, both over the obstacle bridge and his need to avoid it, and ecstasy over his having successfully mastered his bridge terror. However, the entire cycle began once again the next time he tried to drive over the same bridge. Things were much the same for him when he forced himself to attend a party. He felt anxious at the beginning of the evening. The anxiety worsened as the evening progressed. However, after an hour or so, the anxiety peaked and began to diminish, to the point that he was able to introduce himself to one or two people. Now he felt quite pleased and delighted with himself and began to function almost normally. This feeling lasted for the rest of the evening, and once again only to restart the next time he went to a party. Giving the patient good advice. Pinsker generally discourages giving patients specific advice. He tells them that for $11.98, you can buy books that tell you what to do. Instead, he prefers to outline general principles. I feel that outlining general principles, while an excellent idea for treating most patients, may be wrong for those avoidants who misinterpret hands-off approaches as a lack of caring on the part of an unconcerned therapist. This said, therapists who give advice should explain that taking it does not make one a dependent pushover. They should also caution patients to do what works for them, and not to do something simply on the therapist say-so, or on the basis of myths currently in circulation. They should also avoid too specifically telling patients exactly what to do in situations where different reasonable options exist, for here individual choice must reign. I personally feel most comfortable giving avoidance advice on how to develop social skills and overcome specific avoidant pathology. For example, I feel comfortable suggesting that type 1 avoidants try to overcome their shyness by getting out there and meeting new people, while listing some places they might actually go to do just that. But I believe it would be presumptuous of me to decide who among those they actually meet are right and who are wrong for them. Not all avoidants are candidates for the same advice. Therapists giving advice should respect the level of non-avoidance a given individual wishes to achieve, how much closeness and intimacy he or she wants out of life and is capable of attaining. Some so-called avoidants truly want to be loners. Still, others long for a close but not a fully intimate relationship. For some, marriage is the right and only goal. Others fear it will ruin their and their partner's lives. Each avoidant has to determine for himself or herself what, on a continuum from social isolation to full closeness and intimacy, is desirable and possible, and suggest the therapist intervene accordingly. And the therapist should always ascertain how much sacrifice an individual is willing to make for relationships in the way of the inevitable negative accoutrements of meaningful connecting, some loss of self and a diminution of autonomy and independence. Here are some examples of advice I have given to avoidants that they subsequently told me they found to be helpful. Develop a non-avoidant outlook. Avoidants should recognize that the downsides of being alone are far greater than the anxiety associated with closeness, intimacy, and commitment. Seek consensual validation. Avoidants can benefit from confiding how anxious they feel to others. Doing so avoids their seeming to reject others, for most people predictably mistake personal shyness for disdain targeted at them, leaving others less sympathetic and more antagonistic. Learn the art of positivity. As emphasized throughout, avoidants should try to act as positively as they can towards others, becoming kind, generous, and forgiving, instead of being testily unwilling to extend themselves halfway and refusing to negotiate and compromise. They should become empathic as they eschew narcissistic, self-preoccupied pulse-taking, thinking only of my anxiety, without also considering others' feelings, needs, and motivations. Sensitively addressing others' emotional needs, not only one's own, consists of being as apologetic, supportive, generous, and unsadistic as one's anxiety and need for withdrawal will allow, while whenever possible, offering others an explanation of one's avoidance. I am not being antagonistic. I am simply being afraid. Think twice before hooking up with truly antagonistic individuals. Examples of individuals best avoided follow. Those who serve as bad examples because they themselves are seriously avoidant and proud of it, such as people who put things before people, like fussy housekeepers who won't invite anyone over to the house because they fear that they will ruin the furniture. Rationalizers of their own inappropriate aggressiveness as mere assertiveness. Pessimists who tout tragic fiction and set songs to affirm their belief that few, if any, relationships ever work out. One reason why life sucks. Paranoids who can neither trust nor be trusted. Hypermoral individuals who condemn as sinful anything spontaneously and characteristically human, especially human sexuality. Infantilizing individuals who encourage staying home all of one's life to devote oneself completely to taking care of faltering children, needy siblings, or elderly parents. Friends who attempt to act as substitutes for romantic relationships, particularly devastating, are close companions who, when they find their own intimate relationship, dump the avoidant suddenly and without warning. For example, a psychiatrist leaned heavily on and formed a codependent relationship with a psychologist friend who willingly listened to her troubles for many years. Then, when the psychiatrist got married and no longer felt so needy, she told the psychologist that I am out of the shrink realm and into the art realm. So because now we no longer have anything in common, I won't be seeing you anymore. Jealous individuals who ensnare then guard avoidance, luring them into isolating groups, like therapeutic support groups, whose members too readily substitute themselves for individual relationships, then demand group cohesion at the expense of individual freedom and group loyalty before personal achievement and fulfillment. Thus, in a group house on Fire Island, whenever the members of the house sensed that one of the roommates was about to connect, the other members suggested that they all go to the local ice cream parlor and look for men, a place significantly called unfriendlies. Other isolating groups are those whose members expose a Zen-like philosophy of removal as the best or only way to reduce interpersonal anxiety, advocate antisocial behavior as do some rumbling motorcycle club members, or advocate bigotry by word or deed. For example, putting seriously exclusionary bylaws into place to keep out others they deem unacceptable because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Don't stay over long in a relationship that isn't working. Doing that is a particularly bad idea when it is being done out of an excessive sense of guilt about living and a masochistic need to change the minds of those very others who are most set against one. Never use sex as a vehicle for expressing one's avoidance. Hypersexuality should not become a way to display one's fundamental unrelatedness or a way to rebel against a society believed oppressive. Never use sex as a vehicle for overcoming one's avoidance. Sex should not be a masochistic, self-punitive begging where one reluctantly submits sexually just to retain a relationship along the lines of, "I'll do anything you want me to if only you will love me and not leave me." Nor should avoidance make good sex the sole criterion for pursuing a given relationship, especially if they are planning all along to abandon the relationship when the sex loses its luster. When involved in a committed sexual relationship, try to practice 100% fidelity. Especially for avoidance, cheating tends to be more an avoidant problem than a non-avoidant solution, something that puts distance between people by creating personal guilt and partner resentment, even in partners who at first seem willing to go along. Therefore, avoidance should confine their extramarital relationships to incomplete relationships collected to supplement, not replace. Spousal relationships, a relationship with a pet, where the non-human aspects makes the closeness both acceptable and tolerable, or a non-sexual relationship with a friend, especially a member of the same sex in a heterosexual marriage or opposite sex in a homosexual marriage. A non-sexual relationship where additionally age differences are reassuring, so that homosexuals or heterosexuals may more comfortably adopt an older man or woman as a close companion than a younger one or one of the same age. And close family relationships, as distinct from equally close relationships with strangers. To avoid distancing, avoidants who have any strong outside relationships should always emphatically reassure their partners that "I will not allow this person to come between us or take me away from you." Avoidants often ask me, as their therapist, whether they should try to meet people in singles bars or attempt to connect over the internet. I advise avoidance that, used appropriately and in moderation, these places of approach can help the avoidant find a lasting relationship, but only if avoidants first overcome their avoidance enough to mingle and work any context creatively, looking not for quick sex or a merger, but trying to network with a long-term view in mind. Networking involves slowly but surely and patiently making as many acquaintances as one can, deliberately spreading oneself thin in the beginning, making multiple contacts, developing a circle of acquaintances, then narrowing the newly developing wide band of relationships down to one significant other, the most important individual in one's new life, Mr. or miss right. Needless to say, avoidant behaviors can be as disruptive in singles bars or on the internet as they can be anywhere else. Thus, an avoidant man I finally convinced to go to a bar to try to meet people accidentally negated my advice by carelessly saying loudly and convincingly, "There isn't anyone in this bar that I would sleep with," thinking he was just talking to one of his friends, only, as he knew from experience might happen, to find that as he spoke, everyone else fell silent so that the whole world heard what I said. Because all contact is by nature non-avoidant, avoidance desiring to network need only begin somewhere, almost anywhere. For starters, forming distant relationships in anticipation of gradually getting closer as their anxiety subsides. Avoidance can start by being non-avoidant in some small respect, such as by saying hello to strangers. They can also form experimental practice, transitional relationships that serve the purpose of loosening up, conditioning themselves not to fear rejection, advertising their ability, and getting a non-avoidant reputation by showing others, "I want and am willing to accept people." Avoidance should take care not to fall for the come-ons of dating services that offer miracles in the form of alluring advertisements, virtually guaranteeing to provide them with suitable mates. Disappointment and an unwillingness to try again is their fate, as it is of the avoidants who buy into books and embrace gurus that tell them how to succeed relationally, effortlessly, and in short order, promising an immediate and easy solution to a complex problem that will almost certainly take time and effort to solve. Avoid giving patients bad advice. Bad therapeutic advice includes advice best reserved for non-avoidance, such as "do your own thing," "get your anger out," "play hard to get," "don't say yes when you mean no," and "make complete honesty your best policy." Avoidants need to become more, not less, connected by keeping their anger in, to develop and cement relationships by generally playing easy, not hard to get, by sometimes saying yes when they mean no, being cooperative, compromising, and even submissive, if only to temporarily reduce tension. And instead of always expressing themselves and speaking freely and indiscriminately, by being very careful of what they say and do in the recognition that most times they're only one of many hypersensitive people in any given room. As mentioned earlier, therapists should not routinely give avoidance advice about who specifically is right or wrong, good or bad for them, leading the avoidant on to condemn specific relationships prematurely, and on some trivial and principled but unhelpful grounds. Along similar lines, an avoidant should seek not a compatible partner based on his or her answers to an internet questionnaire, but a simpatico partner who, whatever his or her specific personality profile happens to be, is motivated to make a relationship work, willing to change if necessary, and especially loath to validate avoidant fears of being rejected by others by actually being rejecting. Supplemental approaches. At times, I refer my avoidant patients for an appearance makeover to an exercise guru or to another physician for needed medical care for physical ailments. I sometimes suggest tricks avoidance can use to master the anxiety associated with giving a speech or meeting people at a social gathering. Public speakers can help deal with the fear of fainting associated with stage fright by reassuring themselves that they are not losing consciousness by moving about in place, wiggling clothes, tightening the thighs and buttocks in a symbolic attempt to get the blood to flow back to the brain, sucking on a mentholated cough drop or sugar candy to refresh themselves, or having a sip of ice water to shock themselves back into focus. They can also make their audience seem less frightening by demeaning them, for example, by imagining them in a ridiculous pose so that the audience looks as ridiculous to the speaker as the speaker feels he or she looks to the audience. I often recommend the following healthier defenses as potentially salutary substitutes for defensive withdrawal. Healthy defenses are also mentioned in chapters 11 and 20. Healthy avoidance, which allows patients to retreat from unimportant, uncomfortable relationships in order to prevent discomfort in these relationships from spreading to contaminate and destroy potentially productive social and personal contexts. Healthy avoidance is specifically discussed in Chapter 3. Healthy denial and counterphobia. To cope with criticism and rejection, and to overcome anxiety about becoming intimate, short of becoming an extensively frantic, gregarious, hypomanic, who pushes too hard and acts too precipitously to master his or her terror of doing anything at all. Healthy projection, involving an "it's you, not me" philosophy, particularly useful in an emergency where one's self-esteem has fallen and badly needs a temporary lift through a reduction of self-blame via blaming others. Healthy identification, becoming like others who are less fearful and less guilty, more self-tolerant and more self-assertive. While this is controversial, therapists can, in selected cases and in a limited way, become identification figures through sharing personal experiences by telling their patients how the therapist warded off or actually resolved his or her own problems with avoidance, doing this in the hope of encouraging his or her patients to identify with the non-avoidant therapist. However, sharing experiences, life stories, life problems, and personal triumphs, while likely to be effective with dependent avoidance, who hang on a therapist's every word, and with obsessive-compulsive avoidance, who are so paralyzed when it comes to making any interpersonal progress that they beg to be told what to do, even though at their most resistant they plan not to do it, or to do the opposite, is likely to be a bad idea for paranoid avoidance, who suspect their therapists of wanting to steal their money by talking about themselves on their time and dime, and for alarmist histrionic avoidance, who see any signs of avoidance in the supposedly healthy therapist as indicative of the complete hopelessness of their own situation, and as a bad sign for the outcome of their therapy.